So the plan at the moment is that we're going to have an exam a week from Friday. So if that is the case, then you will be receiving a study guide on Friday, this Friday, or a week from Friday. I do not give exams less than a week after I give you a study guide. I'll make that decision closer to the end of the week. For the moment, worst case, expect there is an exam in here a week from Friday. We'll see how much we've covered by then. That's always the dictator of when I want to give an exam. It's just based on how much material we've covered and whether it makes sense, whether we have an hour's worth of content that I can throw on an exam. We've been talking about the layered tetrad. We were starting to introduce the layered tetrad last time, so we're going to do a good bit of this today. That probably means today is a very lecture-heavy day, but I'll try to intersperse some questions to keep engagement relatively high as we go over these. So remember that this is just a layered elemental tetrad. So there are the four components: mechanics, aesthetics, technology, and narrative, that are going to be at the inscribed layer, the dynamic layer, and the cultural layer. So the inscribed layer was everything that the game, that exists in the game when it's not being played. A lot of this is at the design level. So we talked about how each of these work from the design level. So mechanics, the systems that are in place that are designed for the game, that's the theoretical constructs behind the gameplay. So rules, interaction patterns, objectives, resources, boundaries. The aesthetics, how the game appeals to the five senses. Technology is the underlying technology. The narrative, what gets written outside of the scope of the game as it's being played. Then we talked about the dynamic layer. Again, we'll go into more detail about each of these, but the dynamic layer, how the players are interacting with the game as the game is being played. So what happens? What is the emergent behavior from those inscribed mechanics as the player is engaging with the game? What procedures and strategies emerge from that? The outcome of an individual game is a dynamic mechanic. Whether you win the game, lose the game, the score at the end of the game of a particular play of that game is dynamic. The aesthetics, whatever is being generated for the player during the time that they're playing, any procedural art, we talked about injuries that happen from particular playing of the game. How does the technology behave during plays? This could be things like frame limitations, stuttering. This can also be based on the particular hardware that it is on. That can affect how the game is perceived as it is being played. Part of that is from the technology, behavior of the technology during play. This can be anything from how the AI is balanced, whether it feels too easy, too difficult, etc. Any deviations from expected probabilities. So we can design things that mathematically say you should have received a rare piece of gear by the time you reach chapter 2 in the story. If you have not received a rare piece of gear because you just had a very unlucky run, then that experience of what that is like to that player is in the dynamic technology layers. It was possible but unlikely, but it happened. How does the player feel about it? Everything that game code does after launch. From the narrative side of the dynamic layer, what happens procedurally out of the game systems, paths through branching narratives, the actual choices that the player makes when they're presented with different choices, anything that comes from that. So if we use the example of the Sims and a curse from a long playoff absence, so the decisions that you make from that. If anyone else is like me, how long can a sim go without using the bathroom? What happens? It's kind of the player's ability to play around with that, trying to create a narrative around that. The cultural layer, we haven't talked about this. This is where we stopped last time. So mechanics, any mods that are made for the game, anything that's outside the scope of what the developer intended. This is once you release the game to the public, what does the general public do with the mechanics? So if you're changing the mechanics to better fit your play style or something that the developers didn't necessarily intend with the gameplay that you think or someone thinks would be a viable alternative, could be modded into the game. You can have the kind of the cultural pushback as well to design decisions in a game. There was big cultural pushback in Grand Theft Auto 3, the ability to sleep with a prostitute, kill the prostitute, get the money back that you spent. That is controversial. And so that leads to a cultural perception of what is possible within the world that the developers made. So any kind of cultural implication from that is, yeah.
Could this also be like a meta and like a competitive game, like the best stuff to do in the universe, like the community's knowledge of what like the best combos are?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So if you've published kind of optimizations for that or speed runs through a game, how can you mechanically do the best that you can within the game? Sure. As soon as that becomes culturally knowledgeable or you become aware of that. Streaming the mechanics of a game or streaming a game to be able to teach people the rules or onboard them, create a tutorial. Any fan art that's made fits into the aesthetics of the cultural layer. Once the soundtrack becomes popular enough for someone to remix it or to play it on their own. Any memes that come out of the game, cosplays of it that show up at conventions. If the game appears in other media, an Easter egg in another game, any use of technology for other purposes than the technology of the game. So something like the ability to automate clicking, any clickers that rely on the use of you actually, if it's a phone game, actually tapping your screen a bunch of times. A lot of people will rather install an auto clicker to prevent the repetitive stress injury. For cultural narrative, any fan-made material, stories told about the game. If I relay to you an experience that I had while playing the game, that is a cultural narrative. Any thoughts on the distinctions between these three layers? Does it make sense is there anything missing from this? Either as a kind of a fourth layer that you would see, anything really missing from an experience of a game that doesn't really fit into any of these? Yeah.
Would marketing potentially be a layer, part of this layer?
Yeah.
Commercials and stuff like that.
Yeah. Anything that you would consume with respect to that, I would say that is cultural, probably aesthetics. If you're showing off gameplay within a commercial, but if you're trying to tell a story about, here are all the stories that you can get. This player did this in this game, therefore that could be part of a cultural narrative. They're trying to get you into the game based on someone else's experience with the game.
Like lots of players, for example.
Yeah.
So this is like fan or player based.
Yeah, it's outside of the scope of the development of the game. The developers have no hand in any of this. It's how the game is perceived, how it is discussed, how it becomes part of culture at large. The developer didn't necessarily intend for that.
You could though, right?
You could, absolutely.
Put culture into.
Yeah, but how the community perceives that is outside of the scope of the developer. You could attempt to get culture to perceive it in such a way, but how it actually perceives it is the reality of the cultural.
Like trying to artificially influence it, like your community catches on, you try to artificially influence it and they don't like that.
My negative perception of League of Legends. That'll come back over and over again, never gets old. So it's one thing to present this in a classroom setting, but just why is it worth distinguishing these as designers? The goal of taking a class like this is to get experience with designing games. So why should, as we design games, why should we think about the layered tetrad? What is the purpose of breaking down a game like this?
Well, we need to know what elements are included in a game that actually works.
Yeah.
When analyzing other games that you enjoy, it's a lot easier if you know kind of this framework to break down how the elements work and why they work. Since, you know, if there's a game you interact with that has like a thriving fan community, you know, and you're interacting with a lot of fan art and stuff, that could be changing your perspective of the aesthetics. And be thinking about that as a designer of like what's the game providing that's also like creating this kind of community, you know.
Sure, absolutely.
Like one thing I think of is Scott Hoffman in his series Five Nights at Freddy's. How like based off the fan art and the confidence seen by his fans, he kind of tweaked further games down the line to make that experience more engaging with his fan base.
Knowing how your games are perceived can help you to develop for the audience that ended up playing that game.
Yeah, so I think that each, with the particular the organization of it all, it seems like a nice like list, you know, like you have kind of 3 phases, and within each of those phases there are things to consider. And so maybe it's it would be nice to have it as sort of, you know, like a check. Are you asking yourself on each one of these phases, like you know, how do I look at what I'm making, and is this element present in what I'm doing? You know, have I considered this element?
Yeah.
You know,
That's very valid.
It seems like from a designer, if you create a game for the whole world, you're gonna localize it to different languages. But you can also use one of these layers to include like different slang or different things that people wear, something, or cultural references.
Yeah, I see it very much like understanding large scale development. If you can break that down into the individual components that were put together, break those down into the individual classes, break those down into the methods, et cetera, you start to have different scopes of being able to analyze a larger whole, break it down into components, and start to understand how those components work together to create the overall picture.
I guess my point in what I was saying was kind of like this structure of how the elements work also kind of is a structure of how development works.
Yeah.
Like it's both a structure of what a game is, but also how do you go through the process of making this, both of those things at the same time.
Yeah.
On the designing element too, you more clearly define domains, so you can set people to work on a specific domain, so that way they don't bleed over into something that's not what you need to do. It defines their task more clearly.
Yeah. Yeah. All of that is very valid. Very good. Very good. So given this structure, how responsible are designers for each of these layers? For the inscribed layer, that should be pretty straightforward. We are responsible for the inscribed layer because without the inscribed layer, there is no game. But how responsible are designers for the dynamic layer? For how players strategize, for how they play the game? Are designers responsible for that? How about for how the game is perceived by society at large? Are designers responsible for that as they consider how they're designing their game? Yeah.
I'd say, well, definitely the inscribed layer. That's like the thing that
By definition, yeah.
And I'd say there is some part of the dynamic layer that they have control over, since they can hire playtesters to analyze the dynamic layer before it's released to the general public. And so then they can tweak the inscribed layer from the like playtesting dynamic layer.
Sure.
But the cultural layer, that's like once it's released, you know, you can kind of anticipate it, but there's so many factors that go into how media is consumed and interacted with.
Yeah.
And it's hard to tell as designers where it's really gonna go. Like, I think an absurd example, it's not really in gaming, but when Morbius released, people made so many memes about it. The studio was convinced it was actually popular and ran it back through theaters. And so it's one of the only movies ever that lost profit in movie theaters twice.
That's really funny. Yeah.
It's Morbin time. No, Morbin time. That's what it was. It was Morbin time.
Yeah.
I think I think that it's, for me, what it seems like is it's like kind of like 100% involved in the first layer, and then like, you know, varied levels of involved in the second layer, lower and lower in the third layer. But I think that in the dynamic layer, I think that developers can absolutely have an impact if they think about like the dynamics of their own game, saying, like, I understand that this is can be a strategy that people will employ, and I'm not going to give it to you. It's not going to be in the tutorial, but it's good, but it's there, and I've thought about this thing. I put it in there. You know, this particular combination of equipment does this thing in this weird way, which I'm not going to, you know, that's for you guys to figure out. I'm not going to give it to you on a golden platter, you know.
Yeah. I would say it's 100% the dynamic layer. And the reasoning is, just use as an example, this one's the easiest one to see, a multiplayer economy driven game. You must balance around how players are going to play the game, because otherwise you have a horribly imbalanced system that can be exploited by players who have more time, players who have more invest, players who can bot, players who you have to consider every way players are going to play the game in order to create the balance that is going to be necessary in order to appeal to your player base. If you don't understand that in development, the entire player base is going to hate playing your game and think that you can't design around their experience. But to a lesser and lesser extent, that is true even within single player games. Being able to design around, are players going to purchase this weapon as an upgrade?
Like GTA, for example, they had to make the oppressor cost like a shit ton of money in order to make it so that like new player lobbies weren't just being like destroyed by people who were like level 200, level 300.
Sure.
It's like this is a small side. You going off about like multiplayer games reminds me of like the whole problem with Overwatch, where it's like, and like it's like they like the TLDRs that they want a competitive scene, but also they keep adding characters like it's a casual game. So it's like in competitive, you had something called the GOAT strategy, which is basically just idling on the point and call it a day, and that's what everyone did. Just kind of this problem, like they keep adding more characters that reinforce it. Or it's just kind of like they didn't know what exactly they're doing. Are they trying to go for a competitive audience because that they made a fucking leap for that, or are they trying to go for a casual audience? So, which explains why they keep just shitting out new characters seemingly every month. Like, and it doesn't really help the balance.
Someone has a personal gripe with Overwatch. I can tell.
There's a lot that you can learn from the games that are out there and the issues that they have made. Thoughts now on from the design, as you're starting to think of a game and design it, how can you keep the dynamic layer in mind? What would you do in the design process to think about how players are going to be playing your game and strategizing around it? How is culture going to be perceiving your game? How do you figure that out as you're designing it?
You can keep in mind how different play styles are going to interact with it. Like, I mean, it doesn't really matter with the game if it's single player, multiplayer. Everyone's going to come at it with a different perspective, and you can't account for everything. But you're going to want to keep in mind, like, okay, so what if someone wants to just do this like stealth kind of build? Like, how does that fit in the game landscape? How does this feel? How does this feel compared to somebody who's just going in like burning everything? Like, how does that impact the player experience?
I think you could summarize that in understand the psychology of your players. Yes. You need to understand how your players think, what they're trying to do, and how they're going to go about trying to do that, so that you can incorporate that into your design.
Oh yeah, I'd say definitely especially with the narrative, just the emergent story, the choices. But you design the branches that you think players would make certain choices, and you would take the story in those directions.
Sure.
Kind of accommodate those choices.
So that says that game design is not really just a study of technology and how to make that happen. It's a study of psychology and understanding why players play your game. It's a study of economics and how to create an economic system that the players who they are want to engage with. It is a surprisingly deep and complicated process.
Have some actual people play the game.
Yeah, play testing. We need to make sure that we understand, not just from a design perspective, but from the play perspective, what do people think? Do you want that to be yourself, the designer? Do you want that to be people on your design team? Do you want that to be your friends and family? Do you want that to be complete and total strangers? Who do you incorporate into that and how? We'll talk about that entire system of how should you go about that.
I think a lot of it also has to do with like defining the limits, what you want the limits to be as a designer, also like what the options are. And I think it's like after that, it's like unit testing, play testing. You're like, does this thing work how I want to see it? but also being willing to open your mind to maybe somebody else figuring something out and being like, oh, that's pretty cool. You know?
Yeah, you can learn a lot from your players. Keeping an open mind to collecting the data and taking that data and incorporating it back into the design of your game. It's amazing to me how many developers ignore or don't collect enough data. Be able to determine how can the numbers that we can gather from our game feed back into the design of our game or the next game that we make if you're done with the development cycle for this game.
How does one navigate one of these issues that's popular with games? Like, for example, you have a feature that tested really well in QA, but the general public just hates it. How do you address that?
It's worth considering the difference between how are you getting feedback from your QA? How are you getting feedback from the system at large? Incorporate that into your quality assurance moving forward so that you can try to see that issue coming.
So it's like trying to institute like multiple rounds of QA.
Yeah, you might want to go through a smaller scale QA to address small scale bugs and then a larger scale alpha or beta test. A lot of games have an alpha or beta distribution before the patch goes live to be able to address that or to gather larger scale data to be able to see are there larger scale balance concerns that don't show up when we have just a few people playing the game. Depends on really the scope and scale of the game that you're making. So other things that we need to consider when developing game systems, a big one is addiction. Games can be addicting by nature, and just recognizing things like, what are you asking of people who are playing your game? Is there the ability for people to be addicted to your game? If so, is that the developer's responsibility? Is that the player's responsibility? Where do we feel like that goes? Yeah.
On that note, how much of that is in control of the developer and how much of that may be out of their control? Like, yes, the company knows it's addicting, and that's the whole point, whether the developer likes it or not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what can the developer do about it? Might be a good question that we can try to answer. What tools does the developer have?
I think one of the most important parts of that kind of discussion is there a monetization system in place that capitalizes on it somehow?
Yeah, so certainly is there money available, but even just if you're asking your player to always be online, are there ways to accomplish the same thing offline? Are there ways to automate? Are there ways to either limit the amount of time so that the player only has a certain amount of time to do what it is? Limitations for how much trading can happen, limitations for how much time can be spent on a particular activity, giving them a cap, having an energy system, something there where once you're out of energy, you don't really have a reason to play the game as much anymore. These kinds of systems can be used to place artificial limits that you can then design around to keep people from being always online in your game if you get a sense that that might be a moral gray area.
Are psychological barriers kind of one of those things that developers use pretty often?
Yeah.
Like one example I can think of is Nintendo's Wii Sports. Like, it doesn't explicitly stop you from playing, but it pops up being like, hey, you've been on for a while. Why not you break it outside?
Yeah, you can have significant diminishing returns as well on any rewards that you get past a certain level that say it becomes less and less worth your time. And only if you're someone who is really needing just a little bit more progress, it's going to take more time than it's worth. You might as well wait till tomorrow or the next reset or the next downtime to refresh that. Connor already mentioned predatory monetization as well. Whether you're actually trying to maximize the amount of money that you're getting at the expense of people who might be at risk of gambling, especially if you have things like loot boxes where you might be paying for something that is not guaranteed. That became very common and has started to receive pushback, especially in the EU. Yeah.
In terms of like legislation, like how active of a participant are game developers in like trying to come up with effective legislation for this kind of thing?
Yeah, there's a lot of legislation is not really aware of the full scope of the problem or the full scope of what a potential solution might look like. It seems like very frequently it's taken as a black and white issue where the legislation has to either be black or white. There's very little gray area. Yeah.
I like this topic, like the addiction, predatory monetization. This is totally one of those things where you can, the answer I think really is like looking at yourself. If you're developing one of these games that's incredibly addictive and has a ton of predatory monetization, looking at it and saying, well, is this like for the players? Like what I'm doing
Yeah.
right now for the players? And then the obviously answer is no. But there is an argument for having some amount of monetization or some amount of an addictive nature. But
Yeah.
it's like, how far can you
Yeah,
go?
where is the line that we don't want to cross?
Yeah.
As well as any depictions of anything that might be offensive, violence, sexuality, race, culture, anything else that might be potentially offensive. This is something that we should be aware of as developers, that we are introducing into a game and distributing out into the world. It can reflect both on you, the developer, but it can also create something that is a lot larger than you in terms of it can create discussion around the topic. It can create hate around the topic, depending on how it's depicted and how it is taken.
Like, for example, when Call of Duty World War II came out, we saw a really big spike with anti-Semitism because they allowed players to play as the Nazis.
Right. Yeah, that's something that we need to consider as developers. There can also be unrealistic representations of reality. If players play through an experience of something that you have designed, what does that say about how does that create a reality for your players? Are you training them, telling them that the world is the way that it is in my game? That becomes experience that people take forward. And there is something to be said that is up to the player to be able to differentiate between reality and gameplay. But there's also something to be said about the developer being responsible for putting them in that position in the first place. I'm not saying where that line is necessarily. It's something that we need to consider, and we should, when we do design games, we should do so with the intent of knowing how this will affect, or how it could affect our players. Yeah.
I just think it's interesting because like the whole like Grand Theft Auto satanic panic thing, right?
Yeah.
It's like, it's so interesting because like I totally think that there is like a, there's a level in game design where you could influence your fan base, right?
Yeah.
But it's like, I don't know, it's just funny that expectation that Grand Theft Auto would do that kind of didn't really play out like people that thought it was going to play out like,
Yeah.
Yeah,
there's a lot of theory that we can dive into behind just analyzing why people did what they did. What does that mean about games? There's so much here. We could take the entire quarter and just talk about it. We do want to do some other things with the quarter, but it is at least worth considering as we move forward. So, bit of a deep dive. We'll just go through into each of these. So, elements for the inscribed layer, designed and encoded by the developers themselves. The agency of the inscribed layer, right in the hands of the developer. It's the game at rest, as we discussed. Interesting theoretical question. Is a game really a game if it isn't being played? Is the idea of a game a game? Kind of just an interesting. Yeah.
I'd just like to point out something from the last slide, specifically about like the Grand Theft Auto satanic panic thing. That was just a thought I had.
Yeah.
The idea that if what you're putting out hasn't been made before, and you're like toying with the idea, oh, this maybe could do this, but I'm gonna like risk it. That's a little weird, I think, just a little bit.
Yeah, that is a very interesting point.
Well, then you also have to look back and be like, why isn't my responsibility? And I
Right.
think it's usually on a case-by-case basis. For example, say you're a developer and you're a minority group and you want to make a game depicting very real issues of minority groups that people may not find palatable. On one hand, you're running that risk, but on the other hand, you're like, it's the truth. This is the experience. And so I think it's like a case-by-case basis of how much do I want to protect my players and how much do I want to portray this narrative as accurately as possible, whether it be ugly or not.
Yeah. We'll actually have a discussion a little bit about that when I introduce a couple of games that have been designed with that in mind. All right, inscribed elements are encoded experiences. One way of just saying that the developer is responsible for designing this experience. The part of the game that the developer literally put in the game. So designers think, I want my players to experience X. And then they literally code that into the game as X. So that is the inscribed layer. As this gets decoded by the player, that is what happens in the dynamic layer. So that's kind of the relationship between the inscribed layer and the dynamic layer. For the mechanics themselves, any game designer is responsible for those inscribed mechanics. That is the outcome of the design from the designer's perspective. Here are the inscribed mechanics of the game. For any board game, board layout rules, anything you're using within that, cards, dice, any other randomizer that you use in a board game. In general, there are 7 inscribed mechanics that we can note. The objectives, the player's goals, player relationships, how do players relate to other players, what are the competitive, what are the cooperative mechanics within the game, how are players engaging with other players, the rules, what is allowed or not allowed within the confines of the game, what do the players have in their ability to achieve their goals, what are the boundaries, what defines the space between what is part of the game and what is not part of the game. We talked about resources. We talked about spaces. We didn't really talk about this, but this is an important part of what is the game world. Does the game take place on a game board? Does the game take place within a digital representation? What are the boundaries of that digital representation? And then what does the space look like within that representation? Then there's the statistical shape of the game. So any probabilistic nature, any randomization that is within the game. So all of those make up the inscribed mechanics. As a designer, this is what you create in order to have a game that is ready to be decoded in terms of at least the mechanics of the game. Objectives does incorporate more than just the final objective of the game. It's not just win, lose, draw, score, but players are making decisions throughout their experience. They can be smaller scope, they can be larger scope, they can be shorter term, longer term, but in general, we categorize about how far into the future are we looking with regards to this objective. Short term, medium term, long term goals. It's worth breaking down from a design perspective. When we're creating an objective for a player, how far into the future are we expecting them to plan? There's the importance to the player. Does the player care about this objective? Is it something that is really on the side? Is it an optional objective? Is it a required objective? Is it something that a particular player might be more likely to prioritize than another? Do note that there's a difference between the person playing the game and the player's character. So if the player's character is saying, this is really important to me, by the player playing that game, they're taking the role of that player, but there may be a distinction there that may break the fourth wall a little bit. If you don't care about what your player's character cares about, that can be a little jarring to the player. So here's just an interesting, this is a little dated at this point, but Skyrim is still one of the more played games, but as of the writing of this slide a few years ago, under a third of the players had actually finished the main storyline. So objectives within Skyrim aren't necessarily finish the game. Players can get distracted. In fact, so distracted that it ends up being the entire game. That isn't even what was designed by the designers of the game. It's worth noting that objectives can conflict with each other. So as you're designing a game, think about if a player wants to do something and something else, is there a clash between those objectives? Can they work on them in parallel? Can they work on them sequentially? As the player determines things that they want to do, or the game tells them that they need to do or can do, how open are those objectives with respect to each other? as we define games as a series of interesting decisions, one of those possible definitions of games, it is worth noting that how a player decides to go about their objectives, or the game forces them to go about their objectives, can create interesting decisions in and of themselves, just within the design of the objectives of the game. Any questions or thoughts on objectives? We talked a bit about player relationships, but we talked about Tracy Fullerton's, there is player versus game, multiple players versus game, general cooperative play, player versus player, more like 1v1, multilateral competition, unilateral competition, team competition. So all sorts of player interactions. So in general, this is how players can interact with each other and the game as an entity. Do note that how players relate with each other are defined by the objectives that each player is working toward. Whether I want to be cooperative will depend on my objective and the extent to which working with you will help me to achieve my objective. That is a design element that the designer is responsible for. How will players want to work together to try to achieve their individual goals? Is there a goal that is, if multiple players are trying to achieve that goal, is that creating natural tension? Is that creating natural cooperation? That's something that we need to consider as we are designing the game. How will players interact? Think of each player as having conflicting layered objectives, and that creates how the player will interact within the game system. Different players can take on a protagonist role, where you might argue that the player is attempting to conquer the game. The player is the center of the game experience, and the game is kind of static around the player. It may still be dynamic a bit, but it's designed to react to the player and to create a system that is interesting for the player character to interact with. So that's kind of the player taking on the protagonist role. There's the competitor, where players are attempting to conquer other players, where players are the main roadblocks to other players. Players can work with other players in a way of creating an additional cohesive whole. A citizen, players in the same game as other players, but they're not necessarily working with or against them. They're coexisting within the same game world. And note that these aren't necessarily distinct. They can be at a particular time, a player has a relationship with another player that may be one of these roles that changes as the world evolves, as the story evolves, as events happen. These can change. Rules. Rules are less a statement of what is allowed as a very important limitation to what players can't do. Making sure that they can't do the correct things. Games that are played on paper or on a board, rules are the most direct way for a designer to communicate what is intended with the player. In digital games, on the other hand, the code that we write is the equivalent of those rules. You don't want to allow a player to be able to jump off a cliff. You put a fake wall there, and then they can't jump off the cliff. So the rules that are allowed are strictly coded into the game. Game's code, same thing as the rules, but they don't have to be stated quite as clearly because the player doesn't need to interpret. They can attempt an action and see how the game reacts to that. If there is a rule in place, they will discover the effect of that rule through their own exploration. So we can now design explicit or implicit rules. Let's go 1, then 2.
Yeah, I think also with like how code kind of defines the rules. I think it's also good as somebody that's making a game to consider how obvious that rule is going to be there. Like you just want somebody to like, oh yeah, you can't be a coordinate 2450 76 and just you'll instantly die. You don't want to just find that out. You know, there has to be a cliff.
Yeah.
Or something like
that. Yeah. Digital games allow for a level of exploration that's just not possible in Anything on paper.
It's like when people post online about when I boot up into a new game and I need to check if there's fall damage, and so they just find the nearest cliff
Yeah.
and hurl themselves off.
Yeah.
Or when I boot into a new game and I want to know if there's friendly fire, so they turn to their friend.
Things you don't do in real life. What happens if I throw myself out of this window?
I mean, hopefully things get
But have you proven it? Do we really know it? Please don't try. Some of us have. The very first thing some of us did, straight out of the womb, jump off the nearest cliff.
That is actually the only height that is biologically, that's the only fear you have biologically programmed in you is the fear of heights.
Isn't that something that they literally test like right after you're born? They're like,
Yeah, they try to drop you to see if you flinch.
yeah.
So explicit rules, something like roll the die and advance the number of spaces shown. That's something that was told to you. Now you must adhere to that rule. Implicit rules, don't lie about the number shown on the die. This is something that just shouldn't have to be stated, but you can imagine, you know, you just roll the die on the floor, came up a 6. Trust me.
Almost gaslighting is a key game mechanic.
Do you think like the one game where you have to win a game of chess except you're allowed to cheat or something like that?
That reminds me of that one Canadian sport, chess boxing.
Oh,
In one of social reduction games, gaslighting is a key component.
Boundaries, just the edges of the space and time where the game takes place, is that official definition? But really what separates the game from something that is outside of the scope of the game. One way to think about it is if you are inside the boundaries of the game's resources have value and the rules must be followed. If you are outside of the boundaries of the game, the resources do not have value and the rules must not be followed.
Monopoly money.
Yeah. I try to go to a store and purchase something with Monopoly money, it's not going to go so well. What we call the magic circle, the circle is just that boundary. Inside of that magic circle, you are playing the game and adhering to the rules and using the game's resources. Outside of the magic circle, you are not. Any alternate reality game is trying to play with that boundary. You're manipulating the real world, but how you perceive the real world is based on some kind of transformation where the world becomes the game's world in some capacity. This could either be something like Pokemon Go, where destinations in the real world are destinations in the game. It could be something using alternate reality glasses that turn a game piece into a larger scale actual unit or something that to engage with. It can turn people into NPCs. It can turn really anything, but that starts to blur the boundary between the game and reality in some way. Resources, anything that has value in the game. 2 general types. We have assets, objects that are in the game. So links, equipment, houses, hotels, property, and Monopoly. And attributes, anything numerically representing something in the game. So your health value, your strength, the amount of air you have while you are underwater, your experience points. Both of these are resources. All of these are resources. But in general, 2 main classifications of them. We can talk about spaces, anything that can be navigable. So the board in board games, levels in digital games, the actual world as it is designed. As you design spaces, this is something that's incredibly difficult to do, but also rewarding when you get it right. As you design a space, what is the purpose of that space? Why does it exist? What is a player trying to do within it? How does it feel to move around in that space? So can the player move through that space easily? What is their movement speed with respect to the space? How long does it take for them to get from location A to location B? Does the player know where they are Are there landmarks that they can utilize? So is there either a mini map that tells them where they are, or are there landmarks for them to determine how far away they are from where they want to be, or which direction they are facing? Can they orient themselves with those landmarks? Can the player do anything interesting within that space? What is it that they can, how do they interact with the space? Is it just a place for them to be, or can they pick things up, kick things, climb something, look around? What is the player able to do within the confines of that space? And objectives? Does that space contain something for the player to immediately focus on? Something for the player to do in the medium term? A long-term objective within that space? Or are they going to be outside of that space by the time they hit a long-term objective? One thing to think about when designing spaces is trying to create short, medium, and long-term objectives within that space. Otherwise, you're spending a lot of time to create a space that the player doesn't spend a lot of time in. There's a lot of effort to reward ratio, and that's not necessarily a good thing. You want to make most use of the spaces that you are designing from the player's perspective once they're actually playing the game. And we had tables. Any numerical game information. We'll focus a lot on this later on in this course because it is incredibly important to numerically understand the game that you are designing from the player's perspective. Because the player may not have understanding of all of these numerical systems, but the designer absolutely needs to know everything about the game and how it will interact so that they can simulate the player's experience and try to understand how will the player be experiencing the game from that perspective, not necessarily having that level of transparency that you have. When you say, oh, that was an unlikely path through this game, how is the player supposed to know that? So, several purposes, probability calculations, in specific circumstances, how likely is something to happen? So, relative offensive and defensive strengths of two armies based on the terrain they inhabit. Can be useful for progression. How does the player go through, how does the player gain strength? So how often do players' abilities increase, change as the player develops? They are useful for playtesting. Your ability to record information about the game's tests. You can, if you have a full mathematical understanding of the game, then you can create simulations of the game world to gather data without actually going through and playing the game itself. And that can be extremely useful or helpful if you don't want to spend a bunch of money on playtesting. So lots of time spent on inscribed mechanics because this is a lot of what you have the power over as you design your game. So this is probably the single most important section in design. Not to say that other places aren't important, but this is where a lot of the hard work is done when you're designing games. We can at least summarize inscribed aesthetics. We'll probably have to come back to the rest of it tomorrow. But anything perceived by the player's five senses as they play the game, as you're designing the game. So those created and inscribed by the developers. So including things like any visual art that you create for the game. What are the graphics of the game? What is the art style of the game? What are the levels? What do the actual textures look like? Any sound and music that is created for the game? Any tactile elements? This could be something like rumble feedback on a controller, at particular in response to particular elements of the game. Any scented elements? That's kind of a strange concept, but you might imagine that some people get a sense of if you portray a particular event, people may actually have a scent-based reaction to it if it's vivid enough. Taste is probably the weirdest one to put in there, but anything that a player might taste because of the game, yeah.
Bean Boozled.
Yeah, that would do it. Explain for anyone who doesn't understand the reference.
The jelly bean game where you either get a good tasting jelly bean or a bad tasting jelly bean.
Yeah, sure. There are games that can make use of it, but it's relatively few and far between. So we'll go into the five senses and talk about how games can utilize the five senses starting tomorrow. We'll keep going through the elemental tetrad.
Do you
Familiar
think,
tetrad.
do you think this could possibly include like a kind of desire for their substance? Or is that too meta?
Pretty meta, but sure, why not?
Tasting or
Imagine-